Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Divine Fingerprints podcast. I'm your host, Andy Traeger, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Chris Bolkema, one of my colleagues at Hope Christian. Welcome, Chris. Chris and I have worked together for 11 years. She's been at Hope a little bit longer than I have, and we've shared a classroom at least a couple different times in different parts of the building, and I've enjoyed working together over those years. Chris is a math teacher and a very, very good one who's helped a lot of our students get college credit for her classes as well. But other than obviously learning math, what are you hoping that they get out of that class?
I mean, the goal really for me is to point them to the Lord and to help them understand that they can lean on Him, and through some of the stories and conversations that we have outside of the math topics, that they're able to find peace and the Lord in their life.
Right. That's kind of the beauty of teaching at a Christian school. I actually had your daughter in class, I think it was in 2019, when your family went through something really difficult.
Right.
Go ahead and tell us a little bit about what happened.
Over the Christmas break of 2019, as it was winding down, we got notified that my husband was in an accident, a terrible accident, when he was driving his semi in Florida. We got notified that he was killed instantly, and it just basically was one of those moments that breaks you and sticks with you. And all of my kids, except one, were actually home at the time, which was a real gift. So we all were able to sort of, in the immediate moment, navigate that with one another. And so that was a real, it was a rough one. I forgot that was the year you had Rachel.
Right, and it was a difficult year overall.
There were seven seniors in that class that had lost their fathers. 4 of them that year alone, but there were 3 in the couple years prior to that. So there was a lot of growing up that those kids had to do that year for each other. It was, I had one of the girls in my Calculus 2 class.
Right.
And her father passed in September. And then when my husband passed in January, I mean, I look back now, and maybe I didn't know it at the time, but I look back now and see that as, the fact that we were able to go through that and have some conversations about grieving and loss and God and in his goodness even through that stuff. Though that was a real big opportunity that we had to talk about that stuff.
Right. Having lost my own father suddenly, it did cross my mind, because I think I had three or four of those students just in my class, and I think those were largely the ones who lost their fathers during that senior year, which was really difficult. And yours just seemed especially difficult. To think the accident made the national news, and it was...
No. Well, and initially we were informed that he was at fault, and so that, just put a lot of question marks and fear. But luckily, we did find out that the situation was an unavoidable, really, I don't want to say nobody was at fault, but it was just a terrible situation. And I have a friend who lives in Australia, and she told me that she had seen it there, and I thought, wow. Yeah. Well, and the reason I think that it made such a splash in the media was the accident involved 5 kids that were also killed. They were a church of kids from Louisiana that were going to Disney World in Florida, and the accident involved them as well, and so there were 5 other children's lives taken. And there was miraculous things that had come out of that. The lady who was driving that van was pregnant, and 2 months later she had a healthy baby, and she survived. And so there was some lights that we could look at in that situation. But it was a rough time.
Well, I think it's always important to mention, as we kind of think through the God will bring good from things like that. That it doesn't mean that the accident itself was ever good, or that we're calling the tragedy itself good. It's just that there are divine fingerprints, and there are good things that still result.
That's a really good way to put it. That right at the bad things are difficult, and you can't avoid them, but you can certainly find, like you said, the fingerprints that are left behind, or where God had his hand in his protection in that situation. I immediately was able to see some moments that God had just laid down a path of protection for me beforehand. And not that anybody's ever happy or has any positive feelings when stuff like that happens, but when you can find God and you can find his protection and his love through stuff like that, that's what it's about for me.
For sure. It was interesting when my dad passed away. I had this inclination for a couple of years beforehand that someday, I think I'd even said it out loud to people, that I didn't think my dad would make it to 70, and someday I was going to get what I called the call. And that's exactly what happened. Was one morning, he passed away in the night, and I got that phone call the next morning from his friend that found him. And I do think God had prepared me for that, even if I didn't really understand how until the tragedy happened. Do you have any specific things?
Yeah, I had lost my younger brother to suicide in 1996, and I had become a Christian 3 months prior to that happening. And I think back to that, and I feel like I really, in hindsight, can really see God's protection, because that was also a very difficult time for my family. And I feel like having gone through that with my brother, wrestling through the anger and wrestling through the questions that you have when those things happen. And I had a decent amount of time between these two incidents to grapple with, God and his goodness. And I really feel like I had so much peace eventually through that grappling time with my brother's death, that I was able to understand that God can still take something that feels just devastating to us, and we can still see his goodness on the other side. It gave me hope that I can make it through tough stuff. And I don't really mean I made it through tough stuff
Sure.
because I'm tough. A lot of people will, make that comment, but the truth is the only reason that I feel like I have ever made it through any of the difficulties that I've come across in my life were really only because I really lean into the Lord, especially in those times. But I feel like I spent a lot of time learning about God and learning about who he is and his grace and his mercy and his love. And a couple of Bible verses that really have held me together are Isaiah 55, 8 and 9 are my primary life verses, where it basically says that God's ways are higher than our ways and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. And it helps me to know that he's in charge, and I don't have to know the answers to all of my questions, because I trust him through these things. And that really has helped me get through the vast majority of my difficulties. I mean, life just doesn't, not roses and, sunflowers every day.
Right. Do you feel like that experience was able to, in 2019, you weren't just trying to get through this yourself, you were trying to also help your children manage this? Did that help them?
I don't know that it necessarily helped them, but it really gave me some strength to know how to navigate through grief, because grief is one of those things that, you just feel like there's a formula. And what I learned prior to my husband's death, the other grief that I've had, I definitely learned that people grieve differently and that people have a harder time with some things than others. And one of the first things that I told my kids is that you need to let each other go through the series of emotions when they arrive, and we have to have peace and grace with each other, because my younger brother's death really imploded my family, and my birth family never really recovered from that situation. And so I took one lesson from that, is that we have to help one another and not be judgmental about how somebody is grieving, or if somebody's really angry and the other person is really sad, that the anger is not a wrong emotion, and to let each other have their full range of emotions and to love them through it. So that was difficult. Yeah, Rachel was still a senior in high school, and all of the other three of my kids were off in college and off doing their life, but we were able to keep in touch with each other with the phone, and I prayed for them, I prayed with them, and it's just each person has their own journey. So whether I wanted them to get through it or not, it's not something I could help them grieve well. I just could help guide them and love them at the same time. I feel like that's what God gave me, is a lot of love and a lot of patience, and I feel like that's what I tried to offer my kids.
That's two of his many wonderful attributes, and makes a lot of sense. And sometimes I think we see other people and we often tend to give them grace, but sometimes we don't give ourselves enough grace in situations like that.
I I think with all of us, I have 4 kids, and my son was just in the process of starting to date his now wife. So, to watch them go through this, and it's just, there's no easy way to go about it.
And when my dad passed, it was a little bit different situation because my parents had already divorced, and so even though my mom walked through everything with me, it wasn't the same for her. She had already grieved their relationship in a lot of ways, and I don't want to say moved on. To a certain extent, it was different. And even for me, it took a long time for me to feel any emotion because in our case, the relationship wasn't great at the end. And so I remember going through the first really couple months in a pretty cold fashion, which I'm not necessarily proud to say, but that's just the truth. And it was at some moment 3 months later after he'd passed where I picked up the phone to call him, and I recognized I can't do that. That was really the first time I felt more of that sadness, I think, and so it really is an individual process. How has your faith or spiritual life changed, would you say, either since 2019 or maybe just in general?
Well, my faith has remained constant, and I really do feel blessed that I have not had moments where I really feel like I need to doubt and question God. I don't feel that way. I never have felt that way since I became a Christian. But it has deepened my trust. It has deepened my ability to lean on Him. I think that sometimes I have a tendency to feel like, I can do this myself or whatever. The difficulties that I've dealt with in life, I really, really feel like
Same.
I have a lot more freedom to lean in on Him and trust Him. I was talking about a verse earlier that, I know that one of the promises that He gives us is that everything is for His glory, but it's also for my good. And my definition of good and His definition of good aren't necessarily aligned. I want good things or whatever I might define as that, but He promises that everything is for His glory and for our good. And whether I see and understand what He means by that, I don't lose sleep over that anymore. And so I guess my trust that He is good has only deepened, and I have an unshakable trust in that at this point.
I think that's what He would hope for all of us as we go through things like that. How I feel like our students would, you certainly pour into our students at a very deep level, and I think they would think of you as one of our happiest, is kind of a general word, but one of our teachers that really sees things from the bright side.
I was going to say, that's one of the things that I really see in hindsight that God has prepared me for my whole life. I didn't grow up in a traditional Christian home. I had a religion where I did read the Bible, but it was coupled with other books and other interpretations, and Christian Science was the religion. It's a very long description of what it is, but I look back and I see God having been with me as a young child and living through some tough things in my childhood, and I just see that He gave me a gift of being able to have joy through circumstances. And one of the things that I tell my students a lot is, we talk about happiness all the time, but don't chase happiness, because happiness is fleeting. Happiness is I got my favorite Starbucks drink, or I won the lottery, or whatever is happy. That's happiness, and to me it's like a vapor. And what I feel like God has gifted me with, truly gifted me with, is joy. And I can't operate with depression and angst, even though I have those, I can't function in those deep places, those dark places. And so I cling to Him, and I didn't know when I was a kid that He was walking with me and carrying me through that. I just, yes, I do carry myself with a certain amount of jovial spirit. I just look at that as God's gift to me. I don't think naturally, I'm pretty confident that I would not be able to have this kind of peace and this kind of joy had God not been the center the whole time.
I mean, absolutely not. I mean, you think you see that in the people who have Jesus do radiate, and joy is the word I think I was trying to think of earlier. They do radiate that joy, and I actually think, thinking back to a few months ago, that the reason I suggested the podcast, the idea actually came from Bryson, who's in your class now, and I think she just told me that Mrs. Bolkema is so joyful, even though she's been through a lot, and it just was so impressive to her. That's, I think, one of the amazing things about joy when it comes from Jesus is that it's contagious and it's visible and it's something that's not just inside of our heads or even inside of our hearts, but it's something that if you really want people to see Jesus as a Christian, you should live with the joy that the trust that you described should give us.
I don't feel like there's any, I suppose there's moments where I feel like I have to muster a certain amount of pleasantness to present myself in a classroom, because I don't feel like I should ever come to the classroom and have them take on any of my mood for the day that might be negative. I mean, although that does happen. But I think that the truth is that it really does come from every fiber of my being after having surrendered. I think a lot of it, my surrender to the Lord, was also during a very difficult time in my late 20s. And what I felt at that time was freedom. And I previously had thought, oh, look at these Christians. They have all these rules. They can't this and they can't that. And they have to behave in all these nice, sweet ways. And I thought, oh, gosh, they're in just some kind of prison. And once God, made himself, without a doubt, known that he was real, I recognized that those bars that I had been looking through, I was the one in prison the whole time. And now that I had recognized who God is and accepted him and surrendered, and really it was a very large moment of humble pie, humility, and absolute surrender. And when you're able to get outside of yourself and really recognize that this is not about me, none of this is about me, it's a responsibility to carry yourself. But I guess in a way, like I said, I feel like God has just gifted me with exuberance, because I don't try to be like this. In fact, I find it funny when people say that about me, because I can be a little bit snarky at times, but mostly it's out of a joke. But
I think if you're going to teach high school students, you have to be able to be a little snarky at times, or to at least have a sense of humor about the whole thing, because they want to see the real teacher, the real person. And I actually read the chapter in Love Does yesterday called The Puppeteer, which is all about authenticity. And I think we live in this world where so much is curated through social media, and I think we just so crave authenticity, and it's just something that we really need, especially when it comes from Jesus. One final question as we finish. There's probably somebody who's going to listen to this who's kind of in the middle of the tough thing and maybe hasn't seen the redemption or hasn't necessarily seen the evidence that we're talking about yet. And what would you say to that person?
Okay. The truth is that anytime you're going through that difficulty, it's not something you can necessarily circumnavigate. Just recognizing and surrendering the fact that it's something that you're going to have to go through. The only way I know how to get through anything in that kind of difficulty is to surrender to God and to recognize that he's the strength that I need, and to recognize my strength is feeble and his strength is unmatched. And to me, really what it boils down to in the whole of all what we're talking about is a surrender to him, and to recognize that he is who he says he is, and his love is unconditional in a way that I don't really understand. And I think that it's just sometimes very difficult, because when you feel pain, you want it to go away. And so you look for means to either circumnavigate it or to numb it or to mute it. And I think while I don't love the idea of having to go through the fire, one of the analogies that I really, really like is when Shem, Ham, and Japheth were in the oven, the furnace burning. They were in it, but you know who was in there with him? In there. Not just standing outside of the furnace, not just saying, I'll be there for you. No, Jesus was literally in the furnace with them. And that picture for me has really been a good analogy to me, to just recognize that he's in it. He's not just sitting out there being a cheerleader for you or saying, you got this. No, that's not what's happening. And that Jesus is in it with you. And to recognize also, I think I said this earlier, that it's not about me. And so often it feels personal. My younger brother's suicide felt very personal. And to recognize, it's really not about me. Even the good things, it's still not about me. Because the truth is that I don't deserve that glory. God does. So that's the bottom line to me.
And it's not about this side of heaven either.
No.
He's preparing us for eternity, when all of these hurts and sorrows and pain get taken away.
Right.
And it seems in sometimes, especially in the hard times, we're here for a long, long time, but in the grand scheme of eternity and all of that, it's such a blip waiting for us on the other side.
Sometimes we have that existential question of why are we here? And the truth is that the answer for me is to glorify him. And that's what I keep I'm not great at it all the time, but I really do try to keep my focus on recognizing that my purpose isn't about me, it's about him.
For sure. And that's something that I think we all probably wish we were better at, but I think the more you abide in him and the more you seek out his fingerprints, the
Absolutely.
easier it becomes and the more consistent we get. But we won't reach perfection, and we have to give ourselves grace for that too.
Right. Absolutely. All right.
So Chris, thank you for joining us today on the Divine Fingerprints podcast. And listeners, we hope you will join us again next time. Have a great day.
Thanks for having me.